I had an epiphany this weekend, and I think it gels so well with our topic for today. I have told people that, my novel plays like a movie in my head, and then I write it down. Feedback that I've gotten from beta readers is that, like, it's not deep enough. Like, you're very it hurts to say, but superficial when it comes to your writing. And so naturally, once I kind of go back into it again, then I do get all the depth that I need. But I have realized that every time I write a scene, I literally see the characters in front of me. I was just like, Madeleine, you literally have to be the character. Like, I should be sitting here and looking where the character is looking and seeing what the character is seeing and saying what the character is saying.
Now that you mention it, the characters that I can't write in third person, like I have to write this character in first person, are the ones that I feel like I can really be in their head and it's me, you know? Everyone else is third person because I'm like, I'm not in your head, I'm seeing you.
Love that. Love that.
Okay, I have to show you this cup. It looks like a plant pot and it says plant lady on it. I got it for Christmas, but that's not even the best part. Like, it came with shovel spoons.
That is the best thing ever. That is adorable.
And I'm drinking wassail that I made last night.
No idea what that is.
It's grape juice with lemon and orange, and then you put spices like cinnamon sticks and cloves and things in it and let it boil. So it's like a spiced grape juice.
Interesting, but it's hot, I'm assuming.
It's hot, yes.
Okay, so it's like a cider almost, like a hot cider.
Like a hot grape cider.
Interesting. That sounds very interesting. I got this water bottle for Christmas and I now can't get enough of it because it has a little straw. And so I'm just going to be sipping my water here because I was like, this is very addictive. I was like, whoever came up with this type of bottle, yes, please, and thank you very much.
That's so cute. I love it.
Are we ready for this episode? Because I'm super excited.
I am thrilled. Let's do this.
Hi, and let's go. Welcome to Tea and Tales. We are so happy to have you here with us. I'm Madeleine Einal.
And I'm Sarah Sampson. We especially want to thank all of our viewers and listeners and followers on our social media, especially Kaz Lewin and Bernie Bookworm. Love that name, Bookworm. Today we have a super fun episode about head hopping in your novel, especially in third person POV. And we have a special guest, editor Crystal Shelley. So please welcome Crystal Shelley.
Welcome, Crystal. We are super duper excited to have you on today, and especially for today's topic, because even though I don't necessarily always write in third person, I feel this is a topic that writers talk about all the time and wonder about all the time.
Well, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
So let's learn a little bit about you before we jump into the topic. So Crystal, can you give us some of your background and how you got into editing?
Yeah, so I am a fiction editor. I own my own editing business called Rabbit with a Red Pen. I provide line editing, copy editing, proofreading, and authenticity reading, aka sensitivity reading, to both indie authors and traditional publishers. So I work with both. My favorite genres are science fiction, fantasy, and romance. Although I do work outside of those genres in, pretty much anything fiction. I'm not a huge horror person, but otherwise, mostly genre fiction is my favorite. I have a background as a social worker. That's what I started out being in my career. And then I unexpectedly kind of pivoted to editing. I've always loved grammar and spelling and writing, like back, when I was in school and everything, but I never thought to make a career out of it. I just was always interested in it. And so, I decided to completely change careers and started freelance editing, and I've been doing that since 2019.
I also found on your website that you have a course that you give to writers, correct? It's the Conscious Language Toolkit for Editors and for Writers.
Yeah, so it's a PDF resource. They're two separate ones, so that's why it's for editors and for writers, because a lot of the content overlaps, but they are slightly different. But yeah, it's the PDF resource for editors and for writers to be able to look at language and evaluate language for sensitivity, for inclusivity, and just, trying to be more aware of the language we use, the intent behind it, like the origins of some common terms and phrases that we may not be aware might have like a problematic history and things like that. So it just really, both of the resources are designed to help editors and writers be able to identify those things and just become more aware and decide, should I use this word or phrase? Does it fit what I'm looking for? Does it fit the context? Am I speaking to the, to my audience in the correct way? That kind of thing. The one for editors goes into more detail because it's, how do we as editors help writers become more aware? Like, how do we write queries and raise these issues to writers? Whereas the writer one is more just strictly about the words and phrases themselves.
Resources over at our podcast is our favorite word because we love resources.
Just last night, I was talking with one of my writer groups, and one of the people in the group was talking about how they need to learn how to do all those things. They're such a beginning writer, they didn't realize there's so much in the craft to just learn how to get it into the manuscript. And those resources are exactly what they're looking for. And I want to talk a little bit about what is head hopping. Like, how do you know this counts as head hopping versus it's not head hopping in your third person POV?
Yeah, so just kind of to explain what head hopping is. So it happens in third person, usually when a writer is using third person limited point of view. So meaning that point of view is restricted to a single character, which is why it's limited, versus omniscient, which I think we'll probably get into a little more. But head hopping happens when the reader is given insight into the non-viewpoint character's thoughts, feelings, or actions that the viewpoint character shouldn't be aware of. Like maybe something is happening in another room and somehow the reader becomes aware of that without the viewpoint character even being able to know that. So just to give an example, so let's say that just like a quick scene between two characters, I named them Maria and Abby. I just threw out random names, but let's say it says this, like, Maria couldn't even look at Abby. It filled her with too much shame. Abby also felt shame when she looked at Maria, but for hers was for a different reason. So in this example, the reader goes into the minds and thoughts of both Maria and Abby. So if the intent is to write from a single character's point of view in third person limited, then that's considered head hopping because you can't have both Maria and Abby knowing that each one of them is filled with shame without some kind of external observables that the viewpoint character can see or pick up on.
I am not a third person writer, and I don't know for what reason. I think I must have fell on my head or something like that. But I started one of my novels in third person. I was like, why did I write this in third person? And it was actually so funny to me because just because I'm writing third person doesn't mean I haven't learned about head hopping. But as I was reading it, I was like, the amount of times I was head hopping, I was just like, what is happening here? Because it happens so easily. So I think for writers, you shouldn't feel bad when it happens to you because it can really happen so easily.
Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
So you mentioned omniscience, and that's one of the things that people really need to be careful about, whether it's omniscient or third person limited. And I'm doing a beta read right now that my comments on our first chapter were, I don't know if I'm in omniscient or third person. And I've read a book, it's called The Blacksmith's Son by Michael G. Manning. I don't know if you've read it, but it starts in third person limited. And by chapter 3, it's omniscient.
So it was intentional?
I think it was intentional because the rest of the series was all omniscience.
Got it. Huh, interesting.
So when you are talking to people about choosing if they want to be in that omniscience, I know it's out of vogue. Like a lot of people don't like omniscience, but some fantasy is bringing it back. Mm-hmm. How would you suggest they choose which one they want to do?
Yeah, it's really just kind of depends on what they're going for. I think omniscient, like you said, it's rarer these days, and I think that's partly because it's hard to do well, because with omniscient you really need like that strong narrative voice. You need to have this narrator who is all-knowing, and usually they have this consistent voice that's might be irreverent or humorous or kind of ironic, or it's easy to kind of fall into like trying to do third person limited, but then with head hopping, it's like, oh, well, maybe it's kind of omniscient, but you're really kind of following like maybe one character's voice, but then jumping around versus like having this consistent narrative voice, like this kind of all knowing, all seeing presence who's kind of telling this story and kind of telling you what different characters are thinking and all of that. But one thing to keep in mind too, to kind of know the difference between like whether it's omniscient or limited is, a lot of times the omniscient narrator is going to tell the reader things that none of the characters know, right? So rather than like it being like this character thinks this or this character feels this because they're kind of picking up on that, it's like the omniscient narrator is just kind of bringing the reader along in this story versus jumping into the heads of each character.
Okay, so a lot of it depends on that narrator.
So I have a side question to that because I found it so interesting because Sarah mentioned the novels she read where it started with limited and then it went into omniscient. And you were talking about like when you write omniscient, it's about like the characters not knowing these information versus limited where you only know what the characters know. So then you as an editor, if you edit someone's novel and they do something like they mix their omniscient versus their limited, like how would you kind of actually approach that? To be like, either no, my dude, you have to pick one or the other, or you can like have a conversation with them to be like, okay, like what is your vision for this, or what? How are you looking at your novel for this, or how would you kind of approach it as an editor?
Yeah, so I will say that because I do line and copy editing, I don't do developmental editing. So developmental editing is, one of the first steps where they read the story and really assess the plot, the characters, the themes, the story structure, all of that, and help the author nail that down. Hopefully, by the time it gets to me, the author has already figured out what point of view they're writing in. That has not always been the case. I have gotten stories where I'm doing a line edit and I'm like, yeah, that's head hopping. And so usually I have to just point out that they're doing this. I don't think most authors are trying to write in omniscient and just not getting there. I think they're really trying to write in third person limited, but don't understand that that means you're supposed to really stick to that one viewpoint character and not just kind of jump in and just bring in what other characters are doing. So in those cases, I usually have to talk to the author and say, hey, I've noticed this. How would you like me? It's a conversation. How would you like me to approach it? If it's a pretty quick fix, I'll just like highlight and leave a comment on like, this is how I suggest you could fix this. Like, just say like, the viewpoint character is assuming what another character feels. Then sometimes you can add in some like hedging language. Oh, they seem to be angry or seem upset because of this thing, rather than like they knew they were upset, because they're jumping into their head. So a lot of times I'll leave those types of suggestions if it's a pretty straightforward kind of easier thing and I'm doing like a line edit. Now, if I'm doing a proofread where it's the last stage of, right before publishing, again, hopefully those things aren't happening there, and that, if they've worked with a line editor or copy editor, that's already been addressed. So that luckily has not happened yet, and I hope it doesn't. But yeah, so really it's a conversation. Like, what does the author want? Because some authors really want, like, especially with the line edit, like they want me to get in there and like make changes and then they of course have the say of like, okay, ultimately I don't really love that change, or I revise it the way I want to that fits my voice. And so sometimes I am actually making the changes so that they can see what it looks like. Other times it's more like gentle suggestions and things like that. But if it's truly like all throughout the manuscript, then yeah, I need to have a conversation with them. I'm not just going to like go in and start fixing things because I don't know what they want to do exactly. And sometimes there really is no set viewpoint character in a scene. Like if it's like truly jumping around everywhere, I may not even be able to tell like, who is this really, like whose perspective should this be from? In which case, yeah, definitely there are going to be some conversations there with the author.
I love that you said that you make the suggestions and they get to choose. I've had so many people in the last month on all the writer forums upset about editors changing all their things. I'm like, you can decide to accept it or reject it. Like,
right.
You got that power.
Which, I mean, I always reinforce that with authors. And I think most editors do too. But I can understand as an author, like even if you know that you have the power to hit reject, seeing all the, proverbial red ink on, all throughout the manuscript, I get that can be hard to see, even though you're like, okay, ultimately I know that I can hit reject and I can revise it. But yeah, I totally get where authors are coming from with that.
Nell and I were talking about third person POV. We're talking to somebody about how it's kind of a sliding scale, and up here you have omniscience, and down here you have super deep third person POV. And Nell asked me a question. I was like, oh, you know what? I don't know. Maybe you could. Could you have an omniscience POV that jumps to a deep third person mind, or is that a big no no?
I would say I'm not like the expert on like writing craft. So this is just coming from like kind of what I know of these points of view and writing that. I think the nature of omniscient is that the omniscient narrator doesn't really go deep into one character's point of view. They usually tell you like some thoughts or feelings or like what this character is doing and what this character is doing, but as far as like really digging into like being into the character, like having those like direct thoughts that the character is having. And like, I just feel like the nature of omniscient narration is usually kind of more shallow than going like deep inside each character's point of view. So I wouldn't say you absolutely couldn't. I just think that it would take a lot of really, I think, precise and well written work to be able to achieve that. So never say never.
Well, I will flip that over there and then I will ask, if you are in deep third person, is there a part that you will accept when a deep POV head hops? Like, is there an exception for that anywhere?
I would say it would definitely throw me off if it's in deep third person and all of a sudden that viewpoint character knows something that they wouldn't be able to, observe or kind of assume. For that viewpoint character to then like know something that another character is thinking or feeling or doing that typically like you wouldn't think of them being able to do. Like when I see that, I think that would instantly be like, oh wait, what? Like what just happened? Unless there was like an explanation for that. But especially if it's like just like a one-off, then it would feel unintentional and like, okay, maybe the author just kind of slipped into head hopping for one reason or another. But again, doesn't mean it doesn't happen, and maybe the writer is intentionally doing it, but I definitely would notice that, especially if it's like supposed to be deep third person.
I feel like that's one of the situations where you really need to get those beta readers involved and see if it's coming off well to the readers.
Yeah, for sure.
How would a writer, if they were writing in deep third person, how would they stay anchored in one character's POV for an entire scene without head hopping?
Yeah, so one trick I like to use for myself as I'm, reading and editing, but also for writers is to kind of imagine that viewpoint character like having a camera on them, like wearing a GoPro or something, where that camera can see everything that the character sees. It can hear and, pick up on everything that the character can hear. It is magical in that it can go into the character's thoughts and feelings, even though, a camera can't do that. But, just for the viewpoint character. But anything outside of that camera, that viewpoint character is not going to be able to have access to. If something's going on behind them, they would literally have to like turn around to see what's happening, because otherwise that's essentially giving information that that character doesn't know. That camera, yeah, can go into the person's thoughts and feelings, but not that those of any other person around them. Again, just kind of keeping a lens on the viewpoint character and just like, okay, anything outside of that, there has to be either dialogue that's telling them what other characters are saying or thinking. There has to be like something observable that other characters are doing, like they're watching their facial expressions, their actions, and those can tell the viewpoint character what other characters might be thinking or feeling. But really otherwise they're kind of stuck with that camera. So that's just kind of an idea or technique that I like to use to just be like, okay, anything that that camera can't see or hear, you have to come up with creative ways to have that viewpoint character then know what all is going on around them.
I love that you give that camera view perspective, because one of the things that is so difficult for me in writing third person POV is remembering what that main character is actually seeing versus what I have to be seeing in my head so I
Mm-hmm.
know what's going on around them. Just last night, I was beta reading something where the guy had his character sulking a lot and staring at the ceiling, but then suddenly was seeing the facial expressions of the person next to him.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, there's times when that camera, like as a reader, I naturally move it and you don't have to signal the main character turning around or whatever, or looking over. But other times when you do have to signal it, like if you tell me they are staring at something, I am going to keep that stare until they move.
Right.
Have you seen other like major times where somebody's not following their camera or needs to signal the movement of that camera?
Yeah, for sure. Kind of like what you mentioned. I think blocking is important with third person POV because you need to make sure your character can actually see and do and hear the things that you have them seeing or doing or hearing. I've had it where like characters are looking one way, doing one thing, but then they are aware of things that they shouldn't be. Like I said, like behind them or something happening in another room, that they all of a sudden know what other characters are saying when the other characters are like in another room of the house. And there are some quick fixes like having them overhear that or things like that, but the writer has to be very intentional of thinking about what is my viewpoint character doing to allow them to actually know what else is going on around them. But you make a great point that like you as the author, you know what's happening in the scene. So like all the action, everything that's happening, but your viewpoint character doesn't necessarily know all of that. So having to figure out what actions your character is doing to be able to then know everything, like you're kind of having to think on different levels, like the big picture and then the actual details of like the scene itself and what that character's doing.
Well, okay, so here's my thing. So you mentioned the camera view that you have, which I absolutely love. A lot of times I would be writing a scene and then I would be like, she was looking at her blue eyes, or she combed her hand through her purple hair, or something like that. And then my beta readers have told me, okay, but if you are in the deep third person, like you are seeing it, as you've said, like from that camera view. So you wouldn't necessarily say you're combing your hair through your purple hair. You would just say you would comb your hand through your hair or your fingers through your hair.
Mm-hmm.
And so my question though, because I've been thinking about this, like for example, this morning when I was getting dressed, I was like, do I want the blue dress or do I want the yellow dress? I have like my white pearl earrings on today because it vibes with my black dress that I have on. What would you say to writers when they kind of get that type of feedback? When would it be okay for you to be like, I almost want to say notice yourself without noticing yourself?
I will just say character descriptions are hard in general. There's the whole like cliche of you don't have your character stand in front of the mirror and like assess themselves. And, that's like maybe a cheat on giving a physical description. I mean, whether or not that's okay, I think it just depends on your readers, whether they might be like, okay, maybe not the most creative, but, there's a time and a place, right? I kind of get what the feedback is saying about like, I'm not going to necessarily think about like my own characteristics as I'm like assessing myself. I won't say that there's not a valid point to that. And maybe people who are like really into like writing craft are like, no, you would never do that if you're writing in deep third person. But I don't know. I don't see it as like, oh my gosh, you can never do that, or no person would ever like reflect on how they look as they're getting ready in the morning or something. So I wouldn't necessarily take that to heart. Like if that's the way that a writer wants to write their character kind of and kind of add that physical description, maybe there are more creative ways to add that physical description. And you certainly wouldn't want to be like repetitive with it. I do see sometimes authors get pretty repetitive with like kind of reminding readers, like looking into his ice blue eyes, like every time they look into his eyes, like, well, I don't really need to know the color every single time type of thing. That's a separate issue.
Why do I feel like you're picking on me right now?
It was not
Because
intentional.
because we love you, Nell, and we want you to be your best.
Gosh darn it.
So we've been talking a lot about the external physicality of third person.
Hmm.
Let's go a little bit into the internal feelings sort of things,
Hmm.
especially in dialogue, or I find it in my fantasy, my fight scenes, it happens a lot, where you want to give as much emotion into the conversation or into the battle as you have in your head, so people like feel it on that visceral level.
Mm-hmm.
How do you give the emotions of characters that are not your POV character without head hopping to them?
I think that's one of the reasons why head hopping happens a lot of times, is because, the author really wants to show what all is going on in the scene, right? Rather than just focusing, like, especially when you have a big cast and want to share that, it can be tough to not then, dive into it. But kind of like I said, a lot of it is going to be those observables of what that viewpoint character can actually see from the other characters. So even though you're not getting to dive into those characters' thoughts, you can really show a lot through their facial expressions or through dialogue, through their actions. A character who is like going through a lot of like emotional pain might be really closed off and stoic. They might be angry and punching the wall, or just all sorts of things. So writers have to get really creative on, like, okay, how can I show what this other character is feeling without actually diving into it. That's how real life is, though, right? We don't know anyone else's thoughts or feelings. We have to go off of what we can see and feel. And I think it can create even more emotion, that not knowing. It creates that suspense and that tension and that mystery, that if we dive into every character's thoughts, then you might be losing that, because you're telling the reader, okay, character A feels this way, character B feels this way, and character C feels this way. Where like, the reader's like, okay, well, now I know how they feel. Like, but what I really want to know is how these three characters are playing off of each other, and how character A, say the viewpoint character, them not knowing what these other people are feeling, like, what does that do to them internally? Because they might be having to guess at what they're seeing or assume, or maybe there's a misunderstanding. So I think some writers might be afraid, like, oh, I'm going to lose the emotion if I can't really show what other characters are thinking and feeling. But actually, you can increase that emotion and that tension by not knowing, by sticking to that limited point of view, where that viewpoint character really doesn't know everything that's happening. Because that's reflective of real life too.
And I think that makes a very strong argument for being good with your body language descriptions and your micro expressions.
I do have I don't know if everyone listening knows about the emotion thesaurus, but that's a great resource. Okay, well, you two clearly do. And I think a lot of writers do, but I think probably a lot of writers don't. But I actually have it next to me. The Emotion Thesaurus. Yeah, by Angela Ackerman and Becca Puglisi. It is amazing, because like I myself am terrible. Like, I think, like, oh, they're angry, therefore they're like punching the wall or something. That is like one very specific example of how you can show anger. Everyone expresses anger in very different ways. So just like just being able to go into like the physical signs, the internal sensations, mental responses, all these things that, where like different emotion, there's so many emotions that humans can have, and so many ways in which they manifest, that, yeah, being able to show that either in your viewpoint character or in the other characters, to help your viewpoint character, know or guess what they're thinking or feeling. It's a great resource for just getting outside of like, I need to tell the reader exactly what they're thinking or feeling.
I feel so good about myself now that I'm an editor who uses the same thing I do. I'm like, look at me. When you head hop, how badly does it affect the character's arc or the tension of the story? And can you get away with it?
So I'll be honest, like I said, I'm not a developmental editor, so I don't often look at big picture stuff like character arcs. So that one I can't speak to as well on. So apologies for that. But as far as tension, yeah, head hopping I think can definitely weaken tension. So by not knowing how other characters feel or what they're thinking or doing, then that can lead to suspense or potential conflict, or those misunderstandings that are often at the core of a lot of relationships. And head hopping, often it feels jarring and awkward when you're like constantly going back and forth into other characters' heads. I mean, it doesn't have to be like extreme where it's happening all the time, but even when it does, like a lot of times I think readers can identify it, because it just feels kind of like, whoa, like that's kind of unexpected, that shift into another character. Or, sometimes you can get whiplash if you're like truly doing it a lot. But that like kind of awkwardness can ruin tension that the writer is trying to create in their story. So both on a like character level and a craft level, head hopping can really weaken that tension. Maybe character A, the viewpoint character, is going through some kind of emotional turmoil, but then if you start talking about what they're experiencing, and then you jump to character B and what they're thinking about the situation, and then what character C is feeling about it, like all within the same scene, then you're not really letting the reader like sit with character A's experience of what they're going through, because you're jumping around to everyone else. Now, that's not to say like you can't have a different scene with another character being a viewpoint character.
That's something that I always do. I will switch my POV when I switch into a new chapter, but then you have to anchor people into that POV. Sometimes I feel like people will start a chapter and you're not sure where your anchor is. How quickly do you identify that anchor POV? And how do we make sure that anchor is strong enough so the reader isn't concerned about, well, who am I listening to this time?
Yeah, I think it's good to establish the anchor viewpoint pretty quickly, definitely within the first paragraph or two. I mean, I know sometimes, the writer might want to set the scene for, this new scene transition, but I'd say within the first, couple paragraphs, definitely having like even often the first sentence, depending on what's happening in the scene, but that way the reader clearly knows, okay, this scene was from this viewpoint, now I'm shifting to this viewpoint. Because I have read things where it has been confusing, where I assumed that it was in one character's viewpoint, and then I'm like, oh nope, that's not right. Then I have to quickly reorient and realize like, oh no, I'm actually in this character's viewpoint. So I think it's a service to readers to just kind of put pretty quickly who the viewpoint character is, and that way they can immediately be like, okay, the writer has shifted now, I'm here, I'm good, and I understand where I am. Because otherwise, yeah, you risk just kind of confusing the reader, which usually isn't ideal.
And I think if you're doing something a little risky with the POV shift, that it's especially important to get those beta readers and editors' comments on whether it's working or not.
Right.
Well, thank you, Crystal, so much for joining us today and giving us your expertise. It is so appreciated to have experts who know so much more than we do.
Yeah, I'm so happy that I could be here and talk about this topic. So thank you.
And if you want to learn more from Crystal, you can go to her website at www.rabbitwitharedpen.com, and you can also follow her at Red Pen Rabbit on Threads, Instagram, and LinkedIn. We will have all of those links as well in the show notes. We like to keep things short here on Tea and Tales. Get your fingers back on the keyboard and your pens back on paper.
And if you like what we are doing here, you love the topics that we are discussing, and you love the guests that we have on, go follow us on Instagram, Threads, and Facebook at Tea and Tales Podcast, and on Twitter/X and TikTok at Podcast Details. And go to that purple icon on your device and go give us 5 stars. And tell us how much you love hate hopping or hate hopping, or the skills or the resources or tips you have found to help you get over your hate hopping. And then you can help us to go up, it's our moment.
Join us next week where we will have guest Miriam Laundrie. Happy writing.
Bye.